The steam from the industrial kitchen clouded Isabella Chen's vision as she stirred the béarnaise sauce for the 100th time that evening. Her calloused fingers gripped the wooden spoon with practiced precision, the same fingers that once danced across ivory keys in concert halls thousands of miles away. The Pemberton estate's kitchen buzzed with controlled chaos as servers rushed in and out, carrying silver platters to the grand dining room where New York's elite gathered for what they called their monthly charity auction. Isabella kept her head down, focusing on the delicate sauce that could make or break the evening's main course, trying to ignore the familiar ache in her chest that came whenever she heard classical music drifting from the main house. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Isabella had been working as head cook for the Pemberton family for nearly 4 years now. The position paid well enough to cover her daughter's medical expenses and keep them housed in a modest apartment in Queens, but it was a world away from the life she had once known. At 38, Isabella carried herself with quiet dignity despite the weight of her circumstances. Her black hair was always pulled back in a neat bun beneath her white chef's hat, and her dark eyes held depths of experience that most people never bothered to notice. The Pemberton mansion stood like a monument to old money on the Upper East Side, its limestone facade and perfectly manicured gardens serving as a backdrop for the kind of gatherings that made society pages. Tonight was no different. Through the kitchen's service window, Isabella could see glimpses of women in designer gowns worth more than most people's annual salaries, their jewelry catching the light from crystal chandeliers as they moved through rooms filled with priceless art. Margaret Pemberton, the family matriarch, was a woman who commanded attention without effort. Her silver hair was styled in an elegant chignon, and her navy silk dress spoke of understated wealth. She had inherited the family fortune from her late husband's shipping empire and had spent the last decade establishing herself as one of New York's most influential philanthropists. The monthly charity auctions were her pride and joy, bringing together Manhattan's wealthiest families to bid on exclusive experiences while raising money for various causes. Isabella had learned to navigate the invisible boundaries of her employment with careful precision. She arrived each morning at 5:30 to begin preparations, worked through the day in the soundproofed kitchen, and left through the service entrance without making eye contact with the family or their guests. It was an arrangement that suited everyone involved. The Pembertons got their perfectly executed meals, and Isabella got the steady income she desperately needed. The kitchen itself was a marvel of modern efficiency, equipped with commercial-grade appliances that most restaurants would envy. Isabella had initially been intimidated by the sheer scale of it all, but she had quickly adapted, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of chopping, sautéing, and plating. Cooking had become her refuge, a creative outlet that reminded her she still had value even when the rest of her world had crumbled. Her daughter Emma was the center of Isabella's universe, the reason she endured the long hours and demanding schedule. At 15, Emma was brilliant and determined despite the chronic illness that had plagued her since childhood. The autoimmune condition required expensive treatments and regular specialist appointments, costs that Isabella's previous life could never have covered. Every sauce she perfected, every perfect soufflé she created, was ultimately for Emma's future. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that she now cooked for people who attended charity galas while she herself had once been the beneficiary of such generosity. Years ago, in another lifetime, she had been Isabella Chen Morrison, a rising star in the classical music world. Born in Taiwan and adopted by American missionaries, she had shown extraordinary musical talent from an early age. Her adoptive parents had sacrificed everything to nurture her gift, eventually securing her a full scholarship to the prestigious Manhattan Conservatory. Those had been golden years. Isabella remembered the feeling of sitting at a grand piano in the conservatory's main hall, her fingers finding perfect harmony as professors and fellow students listened in respectful silence. She had been featured in musical magazines as one of the most promising young pianists of her generation, with critics comparing her emotional depth to legendary performers. Concert halls across the country had begun booking her for solo performances, and her agent had been negotiating a recording contract with a major classical label. But life had a way of rewriting even the most beautiful melodies. During her final year at the conservatory, Isabella had fallen deeply in love with James Morrison, a charming literature professor who swept her off her feet with his passion for poetry and his dreams of changing the world through education. They married in a small ceremony attended by their closest friends, and for a brief moment, Isabella believed she could have both love and music. James had been supportive of her career at first, attending her performances and proudly introducing her as his talented wife. But as Isabella's success grew, requiring more travel and longer hours of practice, cracks began to appear in their relationship. James wanted a traditional wife who would host dinner parties for his academic colleagues and support his own ambitions for tenure. He began making subtle comments about the selfishness of her musical pursuits, suggesting that true fulfillment came from supporting one's husband rather than chasing personal glory. When Isabella discovered she was pregnant with Emma, James saw it as the perfect opportunity for her to step back from her career. He painted beautiful pictures of domestic bliss, of Isabella nurturing their child while he climbed the academic ladder. Isabella, overwhelmed by hormones and genuine love for the baby growing inside her, agreed to take a temporary hiatus from performing. Temporary became permanent when Emma was born with complications that required immediate medical intervention. The infant spent the first 3 months of her life in the neonatal intensive care unit, fighting for survival while Isabella sat beside her incubator, softly humming lullabies. James, unable to cope with the stress and financial pressure, began staying late at the university, claiming he needed to focus on his research to secure their future. Isabella threw herself into caring for Emma, learning medical terminology and treatment protocols with the same dedication she had once applied to perfecting Chopin etudes. Her piano sat untouched in their small apartment, gathering dust as Isabella's world narrowed to hospital visits and insurance battles. The recording contract was quietly dissolved, and her agent eventually stopped calling. When Emma was 2 years old, still struggling with the autoimmune condition that would define her childhood, James finally admitted what Isabella had suspected for months. He had fallen in love with a graduate student, someone who could give him the uncomplicated support he craved. The divorce was swift and brutal, leaving Isabella with full custody of Emma and a mountain of medical debt that her former husband's professor's salary had never adequately covered. Pride prevented Isabella from reaching out to her former colleagues or trying to restart her musical career. How could she explain the gap in her resume, the absence from the concert circuit? The classical music world was unforgiving to performers who stepped away, especially women who chose family over fame. Instead, Isabella took whatever work she could find, waiting tables, cleaning houses, and eventually discovering she had a natural talent for cooking. The culinary world proved more welcoming than she had expected. Isabella approached cooking with the same methodical precision she had once applied to music, understanding that both arts required technical skill, creative vision, and the ability to move an audience. She worked her way up through restaurant kitchens, learning from experienced chefs who recognized her dedication and natural palate. When the position at the Pemberton estate became available, Isabella saw it as a blessing. The salary was generous, the hours were predictable, and the work environment was private enough that she could maintain the anonymity she had grown to prefer. Most importantly, it allowed her to be home with Emma in the evenings, helping with homework and managing the ongoing medical treatments. The Pembertons themselves were not unkind, merely indifferent to the help in the way that very wealthy people often were. Margaret Pemberton occasionally complimented Isabella's cooking, but never engaged in personal conversation. Her son Richard, a hedge fund manager in his 40s, treated Isabella like an efficient appliance, acknowledging her existence only when he had special requests for dinner parties. His wife Jennifer, a former fashion model who spent her days shopping and attending charity lunches, sometimes wandered into the kitchen when she was bored, but she spoke to Isabella the way one might address a pet, with condescending sweetness that made Isabella's skin crawl. Isabella had learned to tune out the conversations that drifted from the dining room during her years of service. She heard gossip about business deals worth millions, complaints about vacation homes that needed renovating, and endless discussions about which private schools would best serve the Pemberton grandchildren. It was a world of casual extravagance that highlighted just how far Isabella had fallen from her own privileged upbringing. Tonight's charity auction was particularly elaborate, with nearly 50 guests expected for dinner before the bidding began. Isabella had spent the entire week planning the menu, coordinating with Margaret Pemberton to ensure every detail met her exacting standards.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The evening would begin with champagne and canapes in the drawing room, followed by a 4-course dinner featuring Isabella's signature dishes. After dinner, the guests would retire to the ballroom for the auction itself, where they would bid on luxury vacations, private art showings, and exclusive experiences money couldn't normally buy. As Isabella put the finishing touches on the appetizers, she could hear the familiar sounds of arrival in the front of the house. Car doors slamming, voices calling greetings, the rustle of expensive fabric as guests made their entrances. The house staff moved with practiced efficiency, taking coats and directing traffic, while Isabella remained hidden in her domain, focused on the precise timing required to serve 50 people simultaneously. The canapes went out on schedule, tiny works of art featuring smoked salmon, caviar, and delicate pastries that Isabella had perfected over months of trial and error. She watched through the service window as servers circulated through the drawing room, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres to guests who accepted them with the casual entitlement of people accustomed to being served. Isabella recognized many of the faces from previous events. There was Thomas Blackwood, the real estate mogul whose divorce had been front-page news for months. Beside him stood Catherine Wells, the pharmaceutical heiress who collected modern art and young husbands with equal enthusiasm. Near the fireplace, she spotted David and Patricia Huntington, old money royalty whose family had helped found half the cultural institutions in the city. As the evening progressed, Isabella fell into the familiar rhythm of service. The first course went out perfectly, a delicate butternut squash soup garnished with truffle oil and microgreens. She could hear the murmur of approval from the dining room, the kind of sophisticated appreciation that came from people who had eaten at the world's finest restaurants. For Isabella, these moments of recognition were bittersweet reminders of her own refined palate, developed during years of traveling to perform in cultural capitals around the globe. The main course required her full attention, a complex preparation featuring beef tenderloin with the béarnaise sauce she had been perfecting all afternoon. Each plate needed to be identical, a feat of timing and coordination that drew on all of Isabella's professional skills. She worked with quiet intensity, aware that a single mistake could ruin not just her reputation but her employment. As the servers carried out the final plates, Isabella allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The evening was going smoothly, with no complaints from the dining room and no disasters in the kitchen. She began preparing the dessert course, individual chocolate soufflés that would need to be served at precisely the right moment to maintain their delicate structure. It was during this brief lull that Isabella first heard the piano music drifting from the ballroom. Someone was playing Debussy's Clair de Lune, the notes floating through the house with the kind of casual perfection that suggested a skilled amateur rather than a professional musician. Isabella froze, her hands stilling on the dessert plates as the familiar melody washed over her. She hadn't heard live piano music in years, had trained herself to avoid concerts and recitals that would only remind her of what she had lost. But here, caught off guard in the middle of her workday, Isabella felt the old hunger rising in her chest like a physical ache. Her fingers unconsciously moved against the stainless steel counter, finding the familiar patterns of the piece she had once performed hundreds of times. The music stopped abruptly, followed by polite applause and conversation that indicated the performance had been merely background entertainment for the guests' cocktail hour. Isabella forced herself to return to the soufflés, pushing down the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. This was her life now, she reminded herself. She was a cook, not a concert pianist, and dwelling on the past served no purpose other than to make her current reality more painful. The dessert service went perfectly, the soufflé emerging from the oven at precisely the right moment to maintain their height and texture. Isabella watched with professional pride as servers carried the elegant desserts to the dining room, knowing that her work for the evening was nearly complete. Soon the guests would move to the ballroom for the auction, and Isabella would begin the lengthy process of cleaning up, a solitary end to another successful service. But as she began washing the first batch of dishes, Isabella could hear the sounds of the auction beginning in the ballroom. Margaret Pemberton's voice carried clearly through the house as she welcomed the guests and explained the evening's charitable purpose. Tonight's beneficiary was a music education program for underprivileged children, a cause that struck uncomfortably close to Isabella's heart. She tried to focus on the dishes, on the mundane rhythm of washing and drying that usually provided comfort after the intensity of service. But the auction continued in the background, with enthusiastic bidding on items that represented more money than Isabella saw in years. A week at a private resort in the Maldives went for $30,000, a private wine tasting with a celebrity sommelier fetched $15,000. The amounts were casually announced, as if the bidders were discussing grocery shopping rather than charitable donations that could change lives. Isabella was reaching for a particularly stubborn pot when she heard Margaret Pemberton's voice take on a different tone, one of theatrical excitement that suggested something special was about to happen. The general chatter in the ballroom quieted, indicating that the hostess had captured everyone's attention for what was clearly meant to be the evening's highlight. Through the service window, Isabella could see that the ballroom doors had been thrown open, revealing the magnificent Steinway grand piano that dominated one corner of the room. The instrument was Margaret Pemberton's pride and joy, a concert-quality piano that had once belonged to a famous composer. Isabella had dusted it countless times during her tenure, always careful not to touch the keys, always aware of the irony that she spent her days maintaining an instrument she was forbidden to play. Margaret's voice carried clearly through the house as she began what was obviously a planned announcement. The wealthy hostess was explaining to her guests that the evening's final auction item would be something truly unique, a once-in-a-lifetime experience that money couldn't normally buy. Isabella found herself listening despite her better judgment, drawn by the theatrical build-up that suggested something unusual was about to happen. What Margaret announced next made Isabella's blood run cold. The final auction item would be a private performance by the Pemberton household staff, specifically the cook who had prepared their magnificent dinner. Margaret explained to her delighted guests that she had recently discovered Isabella had some musical background, and wouldn't it be charming to hear a little something from the help as a novel end to their evening. Isabella's hands began to shake as she realized what was happening. Somehow Margaret Pemberton had discovered her secret, had learned about her musical past and decided to turn it into entertainment for her wealthy friends. The hostess was already calling for Isabella to join them in the ballroom, her voice carrying the tone of someone who expected immediate compliance from her employee. The kitchen suddenly felt like a trap, with nowhere to run and no way to refuse without losing the job that kept Emma fed and housed. Isabella could hear the excited chatter from the ballroom as the guests discussed this unexpected turn of events, their voices carrying the kind of anticipation usually reserved for watching trained animals perform tricks. Isabella's heart pounded as she realized her carefully constructed new life was about to collide with the world she had left behind, and there was nothing she could do to prevent the collision that would change everything once again. Isabella stood frozen in the kitchen doorway as Margaret Pemberton's voice echoed through the mansion, calling her name with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. The wealthy hostess had positioned herself at the entrance to the ballroom, her silk gown shimmering under the crystal chandelier as she gestured for Isabella to approach. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward the kitchen entrance, their faces displaying a mixture of curiosity and amusement that made Isabella's stomach churn with dread. The walk from the kitchen to the ballroom felt like traversing an ocean. Isabella's chef's white suddenly felt shabby and inappropriate among the designer gowns and tailored suits that filled the room. Her hands, still damp from washing dishes, trembled as she approached the group of Manhattan's most powerful families. The scent of expensive perfume and aged whiskey hung in the air, creating an atmosphere of privilege that Isabella had once known intimately but now felt like a foreign country. Margaret Pemberton smiled with the kind of gracious warmth that wealthy women reserved for charity events and social media photos. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her jewelry caught the light as she extended a manicured hand toward Isabella. The gesture appeared welcoming, but Isabella could see the calculation behind her employer's eyes, the satisfaction of someone who had discovered an entertaining secret and intended to exploit it for maximum effect. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret announced to her captive audience, "allow me to introduce our talented chef Isabella Chen. I recently discovered that our dear Isabella has quite an impressive musical background, and I thought it would be delightful to share her gifts with all of you this evening." The guests murmured appreciatively, their voices carrying the tone of people who had paid significant money for entertainment and expected value for their investment. Isabella felt her throat constrict as she realized the full scope of her predicament. There was no graceful way to refuse without causing a scene that would certainly cost her the job. Emma depended on. Margaret Pemberton held all the power in this situation, and she was wielding it with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced genuine consequences for her actions. The wealthy hostess gestured toward the magnificent Steinway that dominated the corner of the ballroom, its polished ebony surface reflecting the light from dozens of candles. Thomas Blackwood, the real estate mogul whose personal scandals regularly graced tabloid headlines, stepped forward with a glass of champagne in hand. His face was flushed from alcohol and the excitement of witnessing what he clearly viewed as an amusing spectacle. "This should be interesting," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I had no idea the help came with entertainment value these days." His comment drew chuckles from several guests, the kind of privileged laughter that Isabella remembered from her own past but now experienced from the opposite side. Catherine Wells, resplendent in an emerald gown that probably cost more than Isabella earned in 6 months, clapped her hands together with theatrical delight. "How wonderfully unexpected," she exclaimed. "Margaret, you always manage to surprise us with these charming little discoveries." The pharmaceutical heiress moved closer to the piano, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor as she positioned herself for the best view of what she clearly expected to be an amateur performance. Isabella's professional instincts warred with her personal terror as she approached the piano bench. Years of service industry experience had taught her to maintain composure under pressure, to smile and nod even when customers were unreasonable or dismissive. But this situation went far beyond normal workplace indignities. Margaret Pemberton was asking her to expose the most vulnerable part of her soul for the amusement of people who viewed her as little more than sophisticated kitchen equipment. The piano bench felt foreign beneath her as Isabella reluctantly took her seat. She had fantasized about playing this particular instrument during the countless hours she had spent dusting and polishing it, but never under these circumstances. The Steinway was a magnificent creature, its keys pristine, and its tone undoubtedly perfect. Under different circumstances, Isabella would have been thrilled to have access to such a superior instrument. Now it felt like a beautiful trap designed to expose her deepest secrets. David Huntington, whose family name graced half the museums in the city, leaned against the fireplace mantel with the casual elegance of old-money aristocracy. His wife Patricia stood beside him, her expression showing more discomfort than the others, but not enough to actually intervene on Isabella's behalf. The couple represented the kind of refined wealth that preferred their entertainment more subtle, but they were still part of the audience demanding a performance from the hired help. Margaret Pemberton positioned herself near the piano with the air of a concert hall impresario, presenting a featured soloist. "Now then, Isabella," she said with false warmth, "why don't you play something lovely for our guests? Perhaps something classical that showcases your training." The request was phrased as a suggestion, but Isabella could hear the underlying command. This was not a request that could be politely declined without serious consequences. The silence in the ballroom became oppressive as 50 wealthy individuals waited for their entertainment to begin. Isabella could feel sweat forming beneath her chef's hat, despite the air conditioning that kept the mansion at a perfect 72 degrees. Her hands hovered over the keys, muscle memory threatening to betray her even as her mind raced through possible escape scenarios. Every option led to the same conclusion: unemployment and the destruction of the stable life she had built for Emma. Richard Pemberton, Margaret's hedge fund manager's son, checked his expensive watch with the impatience of someone accustomed to getting immediate returns on investment. "Come now," he said with the dismissive tone he usually reserved for underperforming employees. "Surely you can manage something simple. Mary had a little lamb, perhaps." His suggestion drew more laughter from the crowd, the kind of cruel amusement that came from watching someone else's humiliation. Isabella closed her eyes and tried to summon the courage that had once carried her onto concert stages around the world. But that woman felt like a stranger now, separated from Isabella's current reality by years of compromise and survival. The confident performer, who had once commanded standing ovations from sophisticated audiences, seemed like a character from someone else's story, a dream that belonged to a different life entirely. Jennifer Pemberton, Richard's fashion model wife, drifted closer to the piano with the languid grace of someone who had never worked a day in her life. She wore a dress that probably required a team of seamstresses and cost more than most people's cars, her blonde hair styled in waves that suggested hours of professional attention. "I do hope you're better at piano than you are at conversation," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "We've been waiting for some real entertainment all evening." The cruelty of the comment hit Isabella like a physical blow, but it also sparked something that had been dormant for too long. These people saw her as nothing more than an amusing diversion, a curiosity to be examined and discarded when their interest waned. They had no idea who she had been or what she had accomplished before circumstances forced her into their kitchen. Their condescension was based on ignorance and prejudice, not any real understanding of her capabilities or worth. Isabella's hands found the keys with sudden determination, her fingers settling into position with the muscle memory of thousands of hours of practice. The familiar weight of her hands on the keyboard felt like coming home after a long journey through foreign territory. She could feel the perfect tension of the Steinway's action, the responsiveness that marked a truly superior instrument. Whatever else happened, she would not allow these people to mock her without showing them exactly what they were dismissing. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the ballroom with such power and precision that conversation stopped immediately. Isabella had chosen one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire, a composition that required not just skill but deep emotional understanding. Her fingers moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who had performed the piece in concert halls around the world, each note perfectly placed and weighted. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The nervous cook who had been summoned for their amusement disappeared, replaced by the artist Isabella had always been beneath the surface. Her posture straightened, her breathing deepened, and her entire being focused on the music flowing from the magnificent piano. Years of suppressed artistry poured out through her fingertips, creating sounds that filled the ballroom with beauty that transcended the crude circumstances of its performance. Thomas Blackwood's champagne glass stopped halfway to his lips as he stared at Isabella in shock. The smirk that had been permanently etched on his face since her arrival faded completely, replaced by an expression of genuine amazement. The real estate mogul had attended countless cultural events and charity galas, but he had never heard anything quite like what was emerging from his hostess's piano under the hands of her kitchen staff. Catherine Wells felt tears forming in her eyes, despite her best efforts to maintain composure. The pharmaceutical heiress had built her fortune on understanding human biology, but nothing in her scientific background had prepared her for the emotional impact of Isabella's performance. The music seemed to speak directly to something deep within her soul, touching feelings she had forgotten she possessed beneath years of social climbing and business dealings. Margaret Pemberton stood frozen beside the piano, her carefully planned entertainment having evolved into something far beyond her control or expectation. The wealthy hostess had intended to showcase an amusing novelty, perhaps a simple tune that would provide a charming anecdote for future dinner parties. Instead, she found herself hosting what amounted to a private concert by a musician of obvious professional caliber, performing on her own piano with skill that surpassed many of the artists she paid to entertain at her cultural events. The Rachmaninoff concerto required Isabella to access emotional depths she had carefully buried beneath years of survival mode living. Each phrase demanded complete commitment, technical precision married to profound feeling that could not be faked or approximated. As her hands moved through the complex passages, Isabella felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble, releasing years of suppressed grief and longing. David and Patricia Huntington exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing discomfort with the situation they were witnessing. The old money couple had been raised with enough genuine culture to recognize extraordinary talent when they heard it, and what Isabella was producing went far beyond the amateur entertainment they had expected. The performance was transforming what should have been a light social diversion into something approaching a sacred experience. Richard Pemberton loosened his tie unconsciously as he listened to music that seemed to bypass his rational mind and speak directly to emotions he rarely acknowledged. The hedge fund manager spent his days dealing in abstractions and calculations, but Isabella's performance was forcing him to confront feelings that had no place in spreadsheets or profit margins. For the first time in years, he found himself genuinely moved by something that had nothing to do with financial gain. Jennifer Pemberton's carefully maintained social mask slipped as she listened to the extraordinary sounds emerging from the piano. The former fashion model had built her identity around surface beauty and social connections, but Isabella's music was revealing depths of human experience she had never explored. The performance was beautiful in a way that made her own existence seem shallow and meaningless by comparison. Isabella lost herself completely in the music, her consciousness merging with the composition in the way that only happened during transcendent performances. The ballroom full of wealthy spectators faded from her awareness as she accessed the part of her soul that had remained unchanged despite years of compromise and struggle. This was who she truly was beneath the chef's whites and service industry smile, an artist capable of creating beauty that could transform anyone willing to truly listen. The technical demands of the concerto pushed Isabella to her limits, requiring every ounce of skill she had developed during her years of professional training. Her fingers flew across the keys with speed and precision that spoke of countless hours of practice, muscle memory that had remained intact despite years of neglect. Each passage built upon the last, creating momentum that swept both performer and audience toward an inevitable emotional climax. As Isabella reached the concerto's most challenging section, her body swayed with the music's natural rhythm, her entire being invested in the act of creation. The years of cooking and cleaning, of worry about Emma's medical bills and fear about their uncertain future, all dissolved in the face of pure artistic expression. She was no longer the Pemberton family's cook, but Isabella Chen Morrison, the concert pianist who had once been destined for international recognition. The silence that followed the final notes was profound and complete. 50 of New York's most powerful individuals sat in stunned quiet, their champagne glasses forgotten as they processed what they had just experienced. The cruel entertainment they had expected had become something approaching a religious experience, a reminder of human capability that transcended social class and economic status. Margaret Pemberton was the first to break the silence, her hands coming together in applause that seemed inadequate for what they had just witnessed. The sound broke the spell that had held the room captive, and soon the entire ballroom erupted in the kind of enthusiastic appreciation usually reserved for world-class concert halls. But beneath the applause, Isabella could see the shock and confusion in their faces as they struggled to reconcile the extraordinary performance with their preconceptions about the woman who prepared their meals. Thomas Blackwood set down his champagne glass and approached the piano with an expression of genuine respect that would have been unimaginable 30 minutes earlier. "Where on earth did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice devoid of the condescension that had characterized his earlier comments. That was absolutely extraordinary. I've heard professional concerts that didn't approach that level of artistry. Catherine Wells dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, no longer caring about the damage to her carefully applied makeup. I had no idea, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret, how could you have kept such talent hidden in your kitchen? That performance was worth more than anything we've bid on tonight. The pharmaceutical heiress looked at Isabella with new eyes, seeing not the invisible servant she had ignored for years, but an artist of obvious distinction. Isabella remained seated at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys as she tried to process what had just occurred. The performance had been cathartic in ways she hadn't expected, unleashing emotions and memories she had kept carefully contained for years. But now she faced the consequences of her moment of artistic honesty, the questions and attention that would inevitably follow her revelation. David Huntington stepped forward with the dignity that came from generations of cultural patronage, his earlier discomfort transformed into genuine admiration. "Young lady," he said formally, "that was one of the finest performances I've heard in my considerable lifetime. You clearly have professional training of the highest caliber. How did you come to be working as a cook when you possess such extraordinary musical gifts?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding an explanation that Isabella wasn't prepared to give. How could she summarize the series of choices and circumstances that had led her from concert stages to commercial kitchens? How could she explain the weight of responsibility that had forced her to choose survival over artistry, security over self-expression? The story was too complex and too painful to share with strangers, no matter how impressed they might be by her performance. Margaret Pemberton moved closer to the piano, her social hostess instincts finally reasserting themselves as she realized the evening had veered far from her original script. "Isabella," she said with forced brightness, "you've given us quite a surprise this evening. I had no idea when I hired you that I was gaining such a talented addition to our household." Her words carried undertones of calculation, the mind of a savvy social operator, already working to determine how this unexpected development might be leveraged for future advantage. Richard Pemberton loosened his collar as he tried to process the cognitive dissonance of his employee's revelation. The hedge fund manager prided himself on his ability to assess value and potential, but he had completely failed to recognize the artistic treasure that had been preparing his meals for 4 years. The oversight felt like a professional failure, a blind spot that spoke to limitations in his supposedly superior judgment. Jennifer Pemberton approached the piano with genuine curiosity, replacing her earlier cruelty, her model's instincts recognizing authenticity when she encountered it. "Isabella," she said softly, "that was absolutely beautiful. I feel like I need to apologize for my earlier comments. I had no idea what you were capable of." Her words carried the weight of someone genuinely shocked by her own ignorance and prejudice. Isabella finally stood from the piano bench, her legs unsteady after the emotional intensity of the performance. The room full of faces looked different now, their earlier condescension replaced by a mixture of respect, curiosity, and embarrassment. But beneath their newfound appreciation, Isabella could sense the wheels turning, the wealthy minds already calculating how her newfound celebrity might be exploited for their own purposes. The sound of a cell phone camera clicking broke the reverent silence as one of the younger guests began recording video of the aftermath. Within moments, several phones were out, documenting the scene as the story of the extraordinary cook began to spread through social media channels. Isabella watched with growing alarm as her carefully guarded privacy evaporated in real time, her secret talent becoming public property without her consent or control. Patricia Huntington, showing more sensitivity than the others, approached Isabella with genuine concern evident in her expression. "My dear," she said quietly, "are you quite all right? You look rather pale. Perhaps you should sit down and have some water." The older woman's maternal instincts had been triggered by Isabella's obvious distress, recognizing that the evening's events had taken a significant emotional toll. Margaret Pemberton clapped her hands together with the decisive authority of someone reclaiming control of her own event. "Well," she announced to the room, "I think we've had quite enough excitement for one evening. Perhaps we should allow Isabella to return to her duties while we adjourn to the library for brandy and cigars." Her suggestion carried the weight of a dismissal, an attempt to restore the normal order that had been so dramatically disrupted. But Thomas Blackwood wasn't ready to let the moment pass so easily. "Margaret," he said with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way, "I think we need to discuss this situation more thoroughly.
You can't simply send someone with that level of talent back to the kitchen and pretend nothing has happened. This woman belongs on concert stages, not cooking our dinner." The real estate mogul's comment sparked a flurry of agreement from other guests, their voices rising as they debated Isabella's future, as if she weren't standing right there listening to every word. Some suggested immediate concert bookings, others proposed recording contracts, and a few began discussing the publicity potential of her remarkable story. But none of them asked Isabella what she wanted, treating her like a valuable commodity to be managed rather than a human being with her own agency and desires. Isabella felt the familiar panic rising in her chest as she realized her carefully controlled world was spinning beyond her ability to manage. These people meant well in their own way, but they had no understanding of the complexities of her situation, the responsibilities that tied her to her current life regardless of her musical abilities. Their enthusiasm felt as threatening as their earlier condescension, another form of objectification that reduced her to her usefulness to them. Catherine Wells stepped forward with the air of someone accustomed to making charitable donations and expecting gratitude in return. "Isabella," she said warmly, "I'd like to help you restart your musical career. I have connections throughout the cultural world, and I'm sure we could arrange some auditions and performance opportunities. Consider it my contribution to the arts." Her offer was generous but carried undertones of patronizing charity that made Isabella's skin crawl. The weight of expectations and obligations pressed down on Isabella as she stood surrounded by 50 of the most powerful people in New York City, all of them suddenly invested in her future for their own various reasons. Some genuinely wanted to help, others saw opportunity for social credit or entertainment value, and a few were already calculating the publicity benefits of being associated with her story. But none of them understood that her life was more complicated than a simple choice between cooking and performing. Isabella's voice felt small and uncertain when she finally spoke, the confidence she had shown at the piano completely absent from her speaking voice. "Thank you all for your kind words and generous offers," she said quietly. "But I need some time to process everything that's happened tonight. This wasn't something I had planned or prepared for." Her words carried an undertone of plea, a request for space and time that she wasn't sure these powerful people would respect. Margaret Pemberton nodded with false understanding, her social instincts recognizing the need to conclude the evening before the situation became completely unmanageable. "Of course, dear," she said with patronizing warmth. "You've had quite a shock, I'm sure. Why don't you return to the kitchen and finish cleaning up? We can discuss everything else tomorrow when you've had time to think." Her dismissal was gentle but firm, a reminder that despite the evening's revelations, Isabella was still her employee subject to her authority. As Isabella walked back toward the kitchen, she could hear the excited conversations resuming behind her, 50 voices discussing her future, her talent and her story, without any input from her. The sound felt like a swarm of insects, well-meaning perhaps but overwhelming in their collective buzz of opinions and plans. She had performed beautifully, revealed her deepest artistic truth, and somehow managed to make her situation even more complicated and precarious than it had been before. The kitchen felt like a sanctuary after the intensity of the ballroom, its familiar stainless steel surfaces and commercial appliances offering comfort through their mundane functionality. Isabella's hands shook as she returned to the pile of dishes she had abandoned what felt like hours earlier, the simple task of washing and drying providing an anchor to reality after the surreal experience she had just endured. But even as she tried to lose herself in the routine of cleanup, Isabella could hear the voices from the ballroom, the excited planning and speculation that would determine her immediate future, whether she participated or not. Her phone buzzed with text messages as the videos of her performance began circulating online, spreading her story to strangers around the world who would form their own opinions about what she should do next. Isabella Chen had reclaimed her identity as a musician for one transcendent moment, but now she faced the challenge of determining what that meant for the life she had built with Emma, the responsibilities that couldn't be wished away by even the most extraordinary performance. The applause had ended, but the consequences were just beginning. 3 weeks after the charity auction, Isabella's life had become unrecognizable. The video of her performance had spread across the internet like wildfire, accumulating millions of views and transforming her from an anonymous cook into an overnight sensation. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a modern-day Cinderella tale about hidden talent discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. Isabella found herself fielding calls from talent agents, record labels and concert promoters, all eager to capitalize on her sudden fame. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same people who had ignored her for years were now desperate for her attention. Margaret Pemberton had initially tried to claim some credit for discovering Isabella's talent, but the narrative quickly shifted beyond her control. The wealthy hostess found herself in the awkward position of explaining to reporters why she had kept a world-class musician in her kitchen for 4 years without recognizing her abilities. Emma sat at their kitchen table, scrolling through social media comments on her phone while Isabella prepared breakfast. The teenager's autoimmune condition had been stable recently, allowing her to attend school more regularly, but the sudden media attention had brought new challenges. Classmates who had never shown interest in Emma before were now approaching her with questions about her mother's secret past and newfound celebrity status. "Mom," Emma said without looking up from her screen, "there's a comment here from someone who says they remember you from Roosevelt Conservatory. They're asking if you're the same Isabella Chen who won the Morrison competition 20 years ago." Isabella's hand stilled on the coffee pot as memories of that long-ago triumph flooded back. The Morrison competition had been her first major victory, the moment when she had begun to believe that professional success might actually be possible. Isabella sat down across from her daughter, studying Emma's face for signs of how she was processing these revelations about her mother's past. The teenager had always been mature beyond her years, forced to grow up quickly by her medical challenges and their financial struggles, but learning that her mother had once been destined for international recognition was clearly affecting her in ways Isabella was still trying to understand. "I never told you about the competitions because I didn't want you to feel responsible for the choices I made," Isabella said quietly. "Everything I gave up willingly because you were more important than any career." Emma looked up from her phone, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and guilt that broke Isabella's heart. "But what if you could have both?" she asked. "What if this is your chance to get back what you lost?" The question hung between them as Isabella considered the flood of opportunities that had emerged since the auction. Lincoln Center had called offering a solo recital. A prestigious record label wanted to discuss a classical crossover album. Television producers were interested in documenting her journey back to music. Each offer represented a path toward the career she had once dreamed of, but they also required commitments that could disrupt the stable life she had built for Emma. Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had been Isabella's primary contact at Memorial Hospital throughout Emma's treatment. The immunologist had become not just Emma's doctor but a trusted advisor to their family, someone who understood the delicate balance between Emma's medical needs and their financial reality. When Dr. Chen called requesting a meeting, Isabella assumed it was about Emma's upcoming treatment schedule. The doctor's office felt different somehow, as Isabella sat across from the woman who had guided them through Emma's darkest health crises. Chen's expression was serious but not alarming, the look of someone preparing to deliver news that required careful consideration rather than immediate panic. "Isabella," she began, "I've been following the media coverage of your musical career, and I wanted to discuss how this might affect Emma's care." The conversation that followed was both encouraging and sobering.
Emma's condition had improved significantly over the past year, reaching a level of stability that Dr. Chen described as the best they could hope for, given the current state of medical knowledge. The teenager would always require monitoring and occasional adjustments to her treatment, but she was no longer in the fragile state that had defined her early childhood. More importantly, the insurance policy Isabella had obtained through her employment at the Pemberton estate had accumulated significant coverage credits that would continue even if she changed careers. The revelation lifted a weight from Isabella's shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. For the first time in years, Emma's medical security wasn't entirely dependent on Isabella's current job. Armed with this new information, Isabella found herself seriously considering options she had previously dismissed as impossible. The offer from Lincoln Center was particularly appealing, not just for its prestige but for its practical benefits. The proposed recital would pay enough to cover their living expenses for several months, while Isabella transitioned back to performing, and the venue's reputation would establish her credibility with other concert promoters. Margaret Pemberton's reaction to Isabella's newfound celebrity had evolved from initial pride to mounting frustration as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. The wealthy hostess had expected to bask in reflected glory as the discoverer of hidden talent, but the media coverage consistently portrayed her as the oblivious employer who had wasted Isabella's gifts. When Isabella requested a meeting to discuss her employment status, Margaret's response was colder than Isabella had expected. The conversation took place in Margaret's private study, a room lined with leather-bound books and family portraits that spoke of generations of inherited privilege. Margaret sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, her posture rigid with barely controlled irritation. "Isabella," she began without preamble, "I hope you understand that your recent notoriety has placed me in a very difficult position. The media coverage has been quite unflattering to our family's reputation." Isabella listened as Margaret outlined her concerns about the negative publicity, the implications for future charity events, and the disruption to household routine. The wealthy woman's primary worry seemed to be that Isabella's story made her look foolish or cruel for keeping a talented musician in her kitchen. There was no acknowledgement of Isabella's right to pursue opportunities or recognition of the gifts she had shared with Margaret's guests. When Margaret finished her litany of complaints, Isabella took a deep breath and delivered the news she had come to share. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said formally, "I'm giving you 2 weeks' notice. I've decided to pursue the musical opportunities that have become available to me." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth after years of deferential service, but they also felt right in a way that surprised her. Margaret's face flushed with anger and indignation as she processed Isabella's resignation. "After everything I've done for you," she said sharply, "this is how you repay my generosity. I gave you steady employment when you needed it most, and now you're abandoning your responsibilities at the first opportunity for something better." Her words stung because they contained a grain of truth, but Isabella realized that loyalty shouldn't require sacrificing her entire identity. The conversation ended badly, with Margaret making veiled threats about providing negative references and questioning Isabella's commitment to her daughter's welfare. But as Isabella walked out of the mansion for the final time, she felt lighter than she had in years. The job that had provided security had also been a prison, keeping her trapped in a limited version of herself that denied her deepest nature. Emma's reaction to her mother's decision was characteristically thoughtful and supportive. The teenager had spent considerable time researching Isabella's musical background, discovering competition victories and performance reviews that painted a picture of extraordinary talent that had been unjustly interrupted. "I'm proud of you for being brave," Emma told her mother, "but I'm also scared about what happens next." The fear was understandable and shared. Isabella was embarking on a career restart at an age when most musicians were either established stars or resigned to teaching. The classical music world was notoriously unforgiving to performers who had stepped away, particularly women who had chosen family obligations over professional development. But the viral nature of her story had created opportunities that might not have existed under normal circumstances.
James Mitchell, the talent agent who had been most persistent in his pursuit of Isabella's representation, proved to be both shrewd and surprisingly ethical in his approach to managing her comeback. Unlike some of his competitors who saw only short-term publicity value, Mitchell understood that Isabella's long-term success required careful cultivation of her artistic reputation rather than exploitation of her novelty factor. The strategy they developed together balanced ambitious goals with practical limitations. Isabella would begin with a series of carefully selected solo recitals, building her performance stamina and contemporary repertoire before considering more demanding commitments like orchestral collaborations or extensive touring. The approach acknowledged that her technical skills, while still impressive, required rebuilding after years of neglect. Isabella's first professional performance in nearly 2 decades took place at the Kaufman Music Center, an intimate venue that specialized in emerging and returning artists. The program she had chosen was deeply personal, featuring pieces that had been meaningful during her original career alongside newer compositions that reflected her life experiences as a mother and working woman. The audience that evening included many people from Isabella's past, colleagues and teachers who had wondered what happened to the promising young pianist who had disappeared from the scene so abruptly. Their presence was both inspiring and intimidating, representing both validation of her return and judgment of how she had spent the intervening years. Emma sat in the front row, her face glowing with pride as she watched her mother reclaim her place on stage. The teenager had insisted on attending despite Isabella's concerns about the late hour and emotional intensity of the performance. For Emma, witnessing her mother's artistic rebirth was worth any physical discomfort or disruption to her routine. The performance itself exceeded everyone's expectations, including Isabella's own. The years of suppressed artistry poured out through her fingertips, creating music that was technically brilliant, but also deeply emotional in ways that her younger self had never achieved. Life experience had given her interpretive depth that transformed familiar pieces into profound statements about resilience and renewal. The standing ovation that followed felt different from the applause she had received as a young performer. This recognition was earned not just through talent but through courage, the bravery required to rebuild a career that most people would have considered permanently lost. The audience understood they were witnessing not just a comeback but a transformation, the emergence of an artist who had been forged by adversity into something stronger and more authentic. Reviews of the performance were universally positive, with critics praising Isabella's mature artistry and the emotional honesty of her interpretations. More importantly, the concert generated interest from major venues and orchestras, opening doors that had seemed permanently closed. Isabella found herself with more performance opportunities than she could reasonably accept, a problem she had never expected to face again. But success brought new challenges that tested Isabella's commitment to maintaining balance between her artistic ambitions and family responsibilities. The temptation to accept every offer, to make up for lost time by working constantly, was strong. She had to remind herself repeatedly that the goal wasn't to recreate her interrupted youth, but to build a sustainable career that honored both her talents and her values. Emma's health remained stable throughout Isabella's transition back to music, but the teenager's emotional needs became more complex as she processed her role in her mother's sacrificed career. Therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in families affected by chronic illness helped both mother and daughter navigate the guilt and responsibility issues that arose from their unusual situation. The conversation about college and Emma's future took on new dimensions as Isabella's earning potential increased dramatically. For the first time, prestigious universities seemed financially possible, but Emma surprised her mother by expressing interest in more practical programs that would prepare her for careers in healthcare or music administration. The teenager had inherited her mother's sense of responsibility along with her intelligence. 6 months after the charity auction that changed everything, Isabella performed as a featured soloist with the New York Philharmonic, achievement that represented the full restoration of her professional credibility. The program included Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The same piece that had so shocked Margaret Pemberton's guests, but performed now in its proper context with full orchestral accompaniment. Emma watched from the family section, her autoimmune condition well managed through the treatment regimen that Isabella's new income could easily support.
The teenager had grown into a poised young woman who understood both the costs and rewards of pursuing dreams deferred but not abandoned. Her presence in the audience represented not an obstacle to Isabella's success, but its ultimate justification. The final notes of the concerto rang through Lincoln Center as Isabella rose from the piano bench to acknowledge the thunderous applause. In the audience she could see faces from every phase of her life, former teachers who had mourned her disappearance, new colleagues who admired her comeback, and most importantly, Emma, whose love had made everything possible. Margaret Pemberton had not attended the concert, but Isabella had heard through mutual acquaintances that the wealthy woman had watched the televised broadcast from her mansion. The former employer's reaction remained unknown, but Isabella had moved beyond needing validation from people who had failed to see her worth when it mattered most. As Isabella walked off stage that evening, she reflected on the unexpected path that had led her back to music. The charity auction that was meant to humiliate her had instead revealed her true self to a world that was ready to listen. The years in the kitchen hadn't been wasted time, but preparation for artistry that was deeper and more meaningful than anything she could have achieved without understanding sacrifice and resilience. Emma waited backstage with a bouquet of flowers and a smile that made all the struggles worthwhile. The teenager's presence reminded Isabella that the most important performance of her life hadn't taken place on any stage but in the daily acts of love and sacrifice that had kept their small family together through the darkest times. Isabella Chen had reclaimed her place in the music world, but more importantly, she had discovered that true success meant honoring all aspects of her identity: the artist, the mother, and the woman who had learned that dreams deferred could sometimes become dreams fulfilled in ways that exceeded the original vision. The music would always be part of her now, no longer hidden but integrated into a life that was authentically her own. The standing ovation continued as Isabella took her final bow, knowing that this performance marked not an ending but a beginning. There would be more concerts, more recordings, and more opportunities to share the gift that had never really left her despite years of silence. But tonight, with Emma's proud face shining in the audience, Isabella understood that her greatest composition had been the life she had built one note at a time, creating harmony between love and ambition, sacrifice and fulfillment. 2 years had passed since Isabella's triumphant return to the concert stage, and her life had settled into a rhythm that balanced artistic fulfillment with family stability. The modest apartment in Queens had been replaced by a comfortable townhouse in Brooklyn, close enough to Manhattan for easy access to performance venues, but far enough to maintain some privacy from the media attention that still occasionally surfaced around her story. Emma had flourished during this period of stability and renewed hope. Now 17, she had grown into a confident young woman whose autoimmune condition remained well managed through the comprehensive care that Isabella's success had made possible. The teenager had inherited her mother's discipline and determination, channeling those qualities into academic excellence that had earned her early admission to several prestigious universities. The morning routine in their Brooklyn home reflected the careful balance Isabella had learned to maintain between her demanding career and her role as a single mother. She rose at 6 each day, spending an hour at the upright piano in their living room before Emma woke for school. These early morning practice sessions had become sacred time, allowing Isabella to maintain her technical skills while enjoying the simple pleasure of making music without the pressure of performance expectations. Isabella's calendar had evolved to reflect her priorities, with concert bookings scheduled around Emma's school year and medical appointments. She had turned down lucrative touring opportunities that would have required extended absences, choosing instead to build a career based primarily in the Northeast Corridor where she could return home between performances. The decision had cost her some opportunities, but it had preserved the family bond that remained her highest priority.
The relationship with her former employer, Margaret Pemberton, had taken an unexpected turn 6 months earlier, when the wealthy woman had reached out through intermediaries to request a private meeting. Isabella had been hesitant, given the bitter circumstances of her departure from the Pemberton estate, but curiosity and a desire for closure had ultimately convinced her to accept the invitation for coffee at a neutral location in Midtown Manhattan. Margaret had aged visibly in the 2 years since Isabella's departure, her formerly imperious bearing softened by what appeared to be genuine remorse. The wealthy woman had begun the conversation with a formal apology, acknowledging that her treatment of Isabella during the charity auction had been inappropriate and demeaning. More surprisingly, she had admitted that the media coverage following Isabella's revelation had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her own attitudes toward the people who worked in her household. The conversation had been awkward but ultimately healing for both women. Margaret explained that she had established a scholarship fund for domestic workers seeking education or career changes, inspired partly by her recognition of how badly she had misjudged Isabella's potential. While the gesture couldn't undo years of dismissive treatment, it represented a sincere attempt to learn from her mistakes and create positive change. Isabella had found herself able to forgive Margaret's past behavior, understanding that the wealthy woman's prejudices had been products of her privileged background rather than deliberate cruelty. The meeting had provided closure that allowed Isabella to move forward without the lingering resentment that had occasionally clouded her enjoyment of her newfound success. Emma's perspective on her mother's journey had continued to evolve as she matured and gained greater understanding of the sacrifices that had shaped their family's history. The teenager had begun writing about her experiences in essays for school and college applications, exploring themes of resilience, family loyalty, and the complex relationship between dreams deferred and dreams fulfilled. Her writing displayed a wisdom and emotional intelligence that impressed teachers and admissions counselors. The financial security that came with Isabella's restored career had transformed not just their daily lives but their long-term planning. Emma's college education was now fully funded, with enough left over for graduate school if she chose to pursue advanced degrees. More importantly, the stress that had once dominated their household discussions about money and medical bills had been replaced by conversations about opportunities and possibilities. Isabella's relationship with the classical music establishment had required careful navigation as she worked to establish herself as more than just a novelty act or human interest story. Some critics and industry professionals had initially dismissed her comeback as a media creation rather than a genuine artistic achievement, requiring her to prove her worth through consistently excellent performances and thoughtful repertoire choices. The challenge had been met through deliberate artistic choices that showcased her technical abilities while revealing the emotional depth that life experience had added to her musicianship. Isabella had commissioned new works from contemporary composers, premiered pieces that spoke to themes of motherhood and resilience, and gradually built a reputation based on artistic merit rather than biographical curiosity. Her recording contract with Meridian Classical had produced 2 critically acclaimed albums that demonstrated her range and interpretive sophistication. The first, titled Rediscovered, featured romantic repertoire that highlighted her technical precision and emotional maturity. The second, Letters to Emma, presented a collection of pieces inspired by her experiences as a mother, including several original compositions that Isabella had written during quiet moments at home. The original compositions had surprised both Isabella and her listeners, revealing a talent for musical creation that she had never fully explored during her original career. Writing music had become another form of artistic expression, allowing her to process her experiences and emotions in ways that performing alone could not provide. The pieces were deeply personal yet universally resonant, speaking to themes of love, sacrifice and hope that connected with audiences regardless of their own circumstances. Emma had become Isabella's most trusted advisor on these original works, offering feedback that was both honest and insightful. The teenager's perspective had helped Isabella understand how her music was perceived by younger listeners, leading to compositions that bridged generational gaps while maintaining classical sophistication. Their collaborative discussions about music had deepened their relationship beyond the traditional mother-daughter dynamic. The teaching component of Isabella's career had developed organically as her reputation grew and requests for private instruction increased. She had initially been reluctant to take on students, remembering her own intensive training and questioning whether she had the patience for pedagogical work. However, her first student, a 12-year-old prodigy from a working-class family, had reminded Isabella of her younger self and awakened an unexpected passion for nurturing talent. Isabella's approach to teaching reflected her own unconventional path, emphasizing musical expression and emotional connection alongside technical development. She worked primarily with scholarship students from modest backgrounds, understanding the financial pressures and family dynamics that shaped their musical journeys. Her studio, located in the ground floor of their Brooklyn townhouse, had become a gathering place for young musicians who found in Isabella both a demanding teacher and a supportive mentor. The success of her students had added another dimension to Isabella's professional reputation, with several pupils winning regional competitions and gaining admission to prestigious conservatories. Their achievements provided Isabella with satisfaction that was different from but equal to her own performance successes, the joy of watching young talent develop under her guidance. Emma had occasionally sat in on these lessons, not as a student herself but as an observer fascinated by the teaching process. The teenager had shown some musical aptitude but had chosen to focus her energy on academic subjects, planning to study pre-medicine with a specialization in immunology. Her career choice had been influenced by her own medical journey and a desire to help other families navigate similar challenges. The relationship between mother and daughter had been tested during Emma's junior year when a particularly aggressive treatment protocol had caused significant side effects and forced several weeks of hospitalization. Isabella had cancelled concerts and rearranged her schedule to be present for every medical appointment, but the experience had reminded both of them how fragile their happiness remained despite their improved circumstances. The medical crisis had ultimately strengthened their bond while highlighting the importance of the support systems they had built. Emma's medical team at Memorial Hospital had become extended family, providing not just clinical care but emotional support during difficult periods. Dr. Sarah Chen had remained a constant presence, adjusting treatments as needed while helping both mother and daughter maintain perspective during challenging times.
Isabella's relationship with the broader musical community had evolved from cautious acceptance to genuine integration as her artistic contributions became increasingly recognized. She had been invited to serve on the boards of several musical organizations, using her platform to advocate for programs that supported musicians from non-traditional backgrounds. Her own story had become a powerful tool for fundraising and public awareness efforts. The annual benefit concert that Isabella now hosted had become one of the most anticipated events in the classical music calendar, raising significant funds for music education programs, while showcasing both established artists and emerging talent. The event was held each spring at Lincoln Center, with proceeds supporting scholarships for students who might otherwise lack access to quality musical instruction. Emma served as the youth ambassador for the benefit concert, using her communication skills and personal story to connect with donors and media representatives. The teenager's poise and articulation had impressed everyone who met her, leading to speaking opportunities at other charitable events. Her involvement had given her valuable experience in non-profit management and public relations, skills that would serve her well regardless of her ultimate career path. The question of Isabella's romantic life had been a source of gentle pressure from well-meaning friends and colleagues who believed she deserved companionship beyond her relationship with Emma. Isabella had dated occasionally, but had found it difficult to balance the demands of new relationships with her existing commitments to her daughter and career. The men she met often struggled to understand her priorities or the complexity of her family situation. A relationship with David Reeves, a fellow musician and single father, had shown promise during the previous year, but had ultimately ended when his job required relocation to the West Coast.
Both had recognized that their respective children's needs made the long-distance arrangement impractical, despite their mutual affection and compatibility. The experience had taught Isabella that future relationships would need to accommodate rather than compete with her existing responsibilities. Emma had expressed concern that her mother was sacrificing personal happiness for family obligations, a worry that had led to several thoughtful conversations about love, commitment, and the different forms that fulfillment could take. Isabella had reassured her daughter that her current life provided genuine satisfaction and that any future romantic relationship would need to enhance rather than replace the bond they shared. The success of Isabella's comeback had inspired other musicians who had stepped away from performance careers for family or financial reasons. She had received hundreds of letters from women who saw their own struggles reflected in her story, seeking advice about returning to music after extended absences. Isabella had responded to as many as possible, offering encouragement while being honest about the challenges and limitations that such comebacks inevitably involved. A documentary filmmaker had approached Isabella about creating a feature-length film about her journey, but she had declined the offer after careful consideration. While the project would have provided significant publicity and financial benefits, Isabella had concluded that her story was still being written and that premature documentation might limit her ability to evolve as both an artist and a person. The decision to maintain some privacy had been influenced by Emma's input, as the teenager had expressed concerns about how increased media attention might affect her own transition to college and adult independence. Isabella's respect for her daughter's perspective had reinforced their collaborative approach to major decisions, treating Emma as a partner in planning their family's future, rather than simply a dependent whose needs were considered but not actively solicited. Isabella's repertoire had expanded significantly during her comeback years, encompassing not just the romantic and classical works that had defined her original career, but also contemporary pieces that reflected modern musical sensibilities. She had developed a particular affinity for works by living composers, finding excitement in premiering new pieces and working directly with their creators to refine interpretations. The collaboration with contemporary composers had led to several commissioned works that were specifically written for Isabella's technical strengths and interpretive style. These pieces had become signature elements of her concert programs, distinguishing her performances from those of other pianists while contributing to the ongoing evolution of classical music. The commissions had also provided additional income streams that supported her selective approach to concert scheduling. Emma's college application process had provided opportunities for both mother and daughter to reflect on their journey and plan for their next chapter. The teenager had been accepted to several highly competitive programs, ultimately choosing a pre-medical track at Columbia University that would allow her to remain in New York while pursuing her academic goals. The decision to stay local had been motivated partly by her ongoing medical needs but also by her desire to maintain close family ties during her college years. Isabella's response to Emma's college choice had been characteristically supportive, recognizing that her daughter's decision reflected maturity and thoughtfulness rather than dependence or fear of independence. The prospect of having Emma nearby during her college years was appealing, but Isabella had also begun planning for the eventual reality of empty nest syndrome and considering how her career might evolve when her primary parenting responsibilities concluded. The townhouse in Brooklyn had been purchased with an eye toward long-term stability, providing space for both Isabella's teaching studio and Emma's future visits home from college. The investment represented Isabella's commitment to remaining in New York where her career was centered and Emma's medical team was located. The decision had also reflected her desire to put down roots after years of uncertainty and temporary arrangements. Isabella's financial planning had been guided by hard-earned wisdom about the unpredictability of both health crises and artistic careers. While her current income was substantial, she had been careful to save aggressively and diversify her investments, ensuring that Emma's future would be secure even if Isabella's performing career faced unexpected setbacks. The financial advisor who managed their investments specialized in working with artists and understood the unique challenges of irregular income streams. The relationship with her adopted parents, who had provided her original musical education, had been rekindled during Isabella's comeback period. The elderly couple had watched her rise and fall from afar, respecting her privacy during the difficult years, but celebrating her return to prominence. Their pride in her achievements had been mixed with regret about the challenges she had faced, leading to deeper conversations about family sacrifice and the unpredictable nature of artistic careers. Emma's relationship with her step-grandparents had developed slowly but warmly, with the elderly couple serving as additional sources of support and wisdom during her teenage years. Their involvement had provided Emma with perspectives on resilience and adaptability that complemented the lessons learned from her own medical journey and her mother's professional struggles. The question of Isabella's legacy had begun to emerge as her reputation solidified and her contributions to the musical world were increasingly recognized. Beyond her performing achievements, she had become an advocate for musicians facing career interruptions, working with industry organizations to develop support systems for artists dealing with family responsibilities or financial hardships. Her advocacy work had led to policy changes that made it easier for musicians to return to professional careers after extended absences. Isabella's master classes at various conservatories had become highly sought-after educational opportunities, combining technical instruction with discussions about the practical realities of musical careers. Her students appreciated her honest approach to discussing the challenges they would face, including the difficult choices between artistic ambition and other life commitments. The classes had also provided Isabella with opportunities to identify and mentor promising young talent. The annual scholarship program that Isabella had established in her mother's memory had grown beyond its original scope, now supporting not just musical education but also providing assistance for students dealing with family medical crises. The program reflected Isabella's understanding that talent alone was insufficient without the support systems necessary to sustain artistic development through life's inevitable challenges. Emma's involvement in the scholarship program had given her valuable experience in non-profit administration, while connecting her with other young people who had overcome significant obstacles to pursue their educational goals. The teenager's role had evolved from simple volunteer work to substantive program coordination, skills that would serve her well in her future medical career, where patient advocacy and resource coordination would be essential competencies. As Isabella looked toward the future, she felt a sense of completion that had been absent during her original career. The young woman who had once pursued musical success with single-minded determination had been replaced by someone who understood that true fulfillment came from integration rather than specialization. Her music was better because of her experiences as a mother, while her parenting had been enriched by her artistic perspective. The journey from the Pemberton estate kitchen to Lincoln Center had taught Isabella that dreams deferred were not necessarily dreams denied, that life's interruptions could sometimes redirect rather than destroy potential. The woman who had once cooked for people who couldn't see her worth had discovered that true recognition came not from external validation, but from the courage to remain authentic to one's deepest values and commitments. Emma's impending departure for college represented both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of Isabella's primary parenting years, and the start of a new phase where her artistic ambitions could expand without compromising family responsibilities. The transition would be emotional but also exciting, offering opportunities for growth and discovery that neither mother nor daughter could fully anticipate. The piano in their Brooklyn living room continued to serve as the center of their home, a daily reminder of the music that had brought them through their darkest periods and into their current stability. Isabella's morning practice sessions would continue regardless of Emma's physical presence, but their meaning would evolve as the music that had once been refuge became celebration of a life fully lived and authentically chosen. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.